So awesome. Okay, so hi and welcome everyone, right? For those of you who are here with us and attending our very first faculty panel. So as with all of our GSMI webinars, we strongly encourage you to open up the Q&A and send us your questions throughout the panel session. It's meant to be very interactive, and so we want to use this time to answer all of your questions. And so we did have a few questions come in, and so we anticipate that you guys may have. And so our two amazing speakers today will actually answer them right now. And so I am Daisy Duan, and I am the GSMI webinar director. I'm also a fifth-year PhD student in the Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry department at Yale. And I'll be moderating the session with Denisha King. And Denisha, if you want to introduce yourself shortly.
Hi, my name is Denisha. I'm a fourth-year graduate student in neuroscience at the University of Rochester.
Yes, and she will be facilitating questions throughout, and so serving as a webinar coordinator. And all right, so we have two speakers with us today to demystify admissions process, right, and the review process, specifically for PhD programs in engineering. And so can you both briefly introduce yourselves? So what your primary research field is in, where you're currently based, and very briefly, what was your motivation for pursuing a PhD?
Paco, do you want to go, or do you want me to go first? Very nice to meet you, by the way.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm okay either way. I can go first. That's okay with
Great.
you. Okay, so my name is Francisco Robles, but I go by Paco. It's a common nickname for Franciscos in Latin America. So I'm an associate professor at Georgia Tech and Emory University. My lab focuses in biophotonics, basically doing any type of clinical, medical, or even just biological imaging. And we specialize in label-free imaging, so without having to insert like a fluorophore into the environment to visualize the structure. In terms of my motivation for pursuing a PhD, I just always loved academia. I always loved physics and the application of physics towards something that can improve the healthcare of people. I think that really just drew me in. And so I found something that was very physicsy, biophotonics, and using that to improve biology and medicine. So that was my large motivation for pursuing a PhD.
Hi, my name is Carlos Aguilar. I'm an associate professor here also in biomedical engineering at the University of Michigan, and just recently tenured. So I've been here for about a little over 5 years now, 6 years, after 6 years in. And my lab studies stem cell genomics, so trying to understand how muscle-resident stem cells in particular respond to things like trauma and in aging. And we try to understand the molecular language that these cells use after these types of different types of pathologies, and as well as come up with new medicinal interventions to try and prevent these things from becoming dysfunctional. And so our lab is very interdisciplinary, and it kind of falls back, or kind of comes back to I think why I became interested in BME is because I was very intrigued with the ability to try different things, to use different technologies and different techniques. And I would say the thing that kind of unites our research program and what makes us somewhat unique is our ability to bridge this kind of disparate information from sequencing-based, high throughput kind of sequencing-based technologies to, little miniature devices to interact and manipulate cells, to more kind of broad tissue level organization with things like, skeletal muscle function. And so we are a mesoscopic group in that we kind of bridge scales, we bridge information from different types of measurements, and then use these to come up with new types of therapies. So I was really kind of taken by this approach of impacting medicine without necessarily being a physician. I actually grew up with a father who was a physician and didn't really like all the politics that he had to go through, and kind of just wanted to make fun tools. So I I was fortunate to be able to do that and have a wonderful lab and position now where I can investigate different things that I think are interesting, that I hope are fundable, and also lets us, hopefully make an impact on people's lives.
Awesome. Great. Thank you guys so much for sharing. Okay, so we're actually going to go right into really our first question. So a lot of people who are with us right now in the webinar, and also those in our greater CL community, they're also right now in the midst of applying to a lot of PhD programs. And so we would all like to know, right, what are some of the steps in the application review process, and what is the review process like in your respective institutions? Whoever wants to go first. Yes, Paco.
Okay, I can take a stab at this. So I act as the admissions and recruitment chair for EME, GSMI, Emory. And this is a fairly involved process in our end. The applications come in. I basically just do a quick glance at most of the applications to try to parse out who will review those applications, mostly based on field. Are you interested in biomaterials, regenerative medicine, medical imaging, immunoengineering, neuroengineering, cancer technologies, and so forth? And we assembled a committee comprising about 20 different faculty members, and we spent pretty much all of December reviewing about 600 applications. And basically they funnel through me, but my job is to get those applications to the right faculty to review those. Per one application, we'll have 3 different faculty members review that one application and provide their input. And the review that we have is holistic. We don't look at GRAs at all. We just completely skip that. We will look at your institution, GPA, your background. If you've had peer-reviewed publications, that's typically really strong. Research experience. We look at your personal statement. We really read those personal statements. We look at the letters of recommendation. I mean, we look at the whole entire package and evaluate the whole package as a whole. We don't really put more weight in one thing over the other, although sometimes some parts can be stronger. Sometimes the student might not actually put a paper that they had in their CV, but in a letter of recommendation, their advisor says, "Oh, they were second author in this paper. They did a ton of work," and it's like, "Oh, that really lifts that application." But again, it's a holistic view of the whole entire process or the entire application. Once we have the initial review, and each reviewer, again 3 per application, will have comments written down about the application. We'll rate it in some type of number-based system, so that we can have some type of organization. And then what we do is we meet weekly, bi-weekly, and then it's mostly like 2 or 3 touch points through the process, where we discuss the applications that need to be discussed. So there's ones where everybody gives it super great scores, no need to discuss those. Those will be invited out for interviews. There's ones that don't really come up to the top, and we just don't really discuss those either. But there's a gray area for those that can be strong, or there's various different opinions on the application, and we'll go through each one of those and discuss the merits of the application and see whether or not it makes sense to invite that person to the interview. And so this is just for the interview invitation, which we have in March. And maybe I can stop here so I can let Carlos weigh in before I talk further about the actual interview process, because that's a different beast. But that is mostly the paper application, the first screening to see who we're gonna send invitations to for in-person or virtual recruiting event.
Thanks, Paco. We have a very similar structured process whereby it's a written application or an application submitted online. And then we look at kind of 5 different criteria. So we look at things just like scholastic achievement or GPA. We also don't accept GRE anymore. So that is, I guess, a relatively new kind of thing. But we look at GPA, we look at research experience, we look at any kind of outreach, diversity, interactions that aren't necessarily reflected, whether they be athletic, those typically, can't really kind of comment too much about like how important that is, but it is incredibly important for looking at what is, I think, a more complete application. It tells a story about a person. And I think that's something that we try to kind of create is understand the narrative, whether that be the essays, whether that be the GPA, the outreach that this person has done, or what makes this person stand out and or is unique. And so understanding the narrative of a person is really what we try to kind of assess in application. Now, there are things that kind of do make you stand out, things like, publications and the like, and those are incredibly important and helpful, research things, to kind of assess how well you'll perform during research. But it's a very similar process whereby at least 3 faculty will give a rating, and then a subset of those who kind of pass, the different thresholds based on that year will get invited for an on-site interview. We will then kind of have a set, just like Paco said, a gray area of candidates that are kind of not within that top group and not within the bottom group who don't necessarily meet some of those criteria, and ask, are we missing anybody? And then the faculty who are part of the admissions committee will kind of look through those gray area and try to prioritize and ask any individual faculty, they have expressed interest in working with you. Would you like to have them out for an interview? And so we as faculty try to do as many interviews as we can before the actual physical interview in person. So for example, like I will try my best to do Zoom interviews before I do interviews in person. And that's just because during the interview weekends, it is so jam-packed during the days that you can't meet everybody. And I typically don't like to meet 3 to 4 people at a time. I'd prefer it to be one-on-one, because it's really hard when you have 30 minutes and 3 people to get to know. So I try to kind of limit how much one-on-one time I can have with everybody, so that way I can meet as many good candidates as I possibly can. Some of our faculty do that. Some of them try to meet as many as they can on the days too. And so once the person is invited here, then the faculty will take a vote or be asked if they would like to extend that person an offer to come do their PhD here. And so we try to be somewhat fast in turnaround times for extending an offer. But you can kind of, have sometimes takes a couple of days, sometimes takes a couple of weeks for offers to get extended out. So Michigan is a little bit, I think, very similar to Georgia Tech. We probably compete for a lot of the same students, and it sounds like there's a lot of similarities here.
Yeah, I'll pick up from once they are invited to the interview process. I think we differ a little bit on how we do the interview. We'll invite in person upwards of about 90 to 100 people for the in-person interview, and then there's some that have conflicts, some that are international that cannot travel, and so we'll also have a virtual component. And we started this, in response to the pandemic too, when we all had to go virtual. Before it was all in person, or you just had to work your way around to try to interview with faculty on your own behalf if you were international, for example. So now there's a lot more structure to that. We do basically set out 2 days because we're in 2 campuses. We're at Georgia Tech and Emory, so we'll have them Thursday and Friday, and there's massive amounts of interviews and tours. We do poster presentations by students. We started doing kind of rapid research talks by the faculty, those that are heavily recruiting. We'll do like 5-minute presentations that tell you a little bit about what we do and how many students we're recruiting. And that tends to stimulate a lot of interest and conversation among the prospective students. We do the 30-minute interviews. We have this huge matrix to try to organize everybody. Every incoming student has at least 3, somewhere between 3 to 5 different interviews, and the rest of the day is filled out with tours. And then we have different social events. There's a dinner, where the faculty come, and that's a chance to mingle more with students, to mingle with faculty, the faculty to mingle with the students in the case that they're not matched for an interview. But we also tell the students to reach out to the faculty if they didn't get an interview with the faculty they wanted to talk to kind of do more of an individual effort there. It's just a logistical difficulty trying to match everybody with like the 5 different faculty or 10 different faculty they wanted to meet. So there's some realities there. And then one part that's different after the interview, whether that's the in-person or virtual interview, we don't ask the faculty if they match with a particular student. The students actually are just admitted into the program, and then once they get here, they have some amount of time to find an advisor. And so there's some strengths to that, and that we don't need to match everybody right off the bat. And so students can come in like, oh, I'm still undecided between 3 different faculty. I'm going to come in and learn more about the individual labs, maybe attend lab meetings, talk to their students in person. Now that you're here, you have a lot more time to really absorb that culture and make a more informed decision than doing the matching prior to being admitted or being that contingent for your admission. But we also have not done a full year's rotation, which happens in other institutions. We kind of strike some middle ground between the being admitted prior to being admitted to a lab as you're being admitted to the program, and the other side of doing a full year's or maybe 6 months rotation. We do a short, like 1 month to 1.5 months, depending on your program, of trying to find your match. So we admit you based on how excited are we about that particular applicant. And obviously we do survey the demand of certain groups like neuroengineering or imaging. Kind of the demand for students comes and goes in waves. And so we try to gauge that to see, okay, should we bring in more students with that interest?
If I may, one thing that I think well, several of us faculty have really tried to do over the past, kind of few years is evaluate what we would just call kind of, the extra components, because I think one of the, kind of negative things associated with COVID was really that it was hard to gain research experience in the lab. And so that had, a very profound effect on a number of students being able to come into lab to learn, basic research techniques that are aside from or that they would get in lab courses. And so a fair number of undergrads, for example, that, I kind of informally mentor, we tried to do, kind of data processing and data analytics. And so these types of things don't really show up necessarily on research experience very well. Part-time kind of data analytics is not really the kind of thing that you can put on your resume very well, because what does that mean, right? But they're important. And so I think something that we try to kind of look for, or something that we specifically try to make sure that we at least include in this kind of narrative for each person, is things like willingness or, ability to kind of overcome a hurdle, whether that's, being in the lab to do research, or being able to manage, an athletic event, or being a part of an athletic team and trying to do research and apply to graduate school. These things are really hard, and it's really tough to do for a lot of us. I know, and I empathize with this in part because I played college soccer, and I know how hard it was, and it's even harder today than it was back then. And so I think these things are very kind of helpful to instruct and call out in things like your essays, to make that apparent that this is, we didn't just go to school and kind of party all the time. We actually did quite a lot, right? And I think those types of things really do go a long way in creating a standout application when we kind of construct this narrative about each person. So any things that you can do to kind of call out those types of small things, maybe they're, not necessarily the kind of publication line, but they have significant merit and create a really impactful story, I think would be really helpful for these types of applications to stand out in these reviews.
Thank you guys so much. Those are extremely thoughtful, extensive responses that your responses also kind of trickle into the later questions I'll be asking. But so you guys actually both touched on this a little bit when you guys were talking about like reviewing or screening applications, right? But I think, given I truly believe, and I think it was Carlos and Paco, you were saying like with the not looking at GRE scores because of the whole like Brexit movement, right? Like since 2020. And so aside from that, like when it comes to grad school apps, right? Like, are there steps taken to remove certain biases like the university name? Like if someone were to go to a big name school or like a small like college in a rural town, or even GPA. Yeah.
I can start if that's okay, just really fast. So we don't blind to a university name and don't blind the GPA at first. It is one metric among several metrics, and we do or ask people who review the applications to weight appropriately the the GPA from different universities in a different way. Namely, so like the smaller universities that may have different GPA scales, or even universities abroad that have GPA scales that aren't necessarily the same as ours. So we do ask that everybody try to weight them appropriately. We give a rubric for those types of things. So
Yeah, but we do the same thing. I think the only add that I have here is that for universities that might not have such a emphasis on research, for example, we're very cognizant that the opportunities might not be the same as those that are attending very research-oriented institutions. And so if you see that, well, maybe they only had a couple of summer experiences with research, but they were really active in other things, we'll take that into account and say that this does show the student going above and beyond. We like to kind of have a grit metric, right, to see like how much that person have to work to get to where they are, because certainly you don't always have by any means a level playing field for everybody, right? So somebody at Yale will be exposed to a lot more research opportunity than somebody in a historic Black college, for example. And so we keep that in mind as we're going through these applications, and mostly we do emphasize the word grit quite a bit, because each person is on their own individual scale, right? And we try to get to know the applicant as much as possible and weigh them on their own merit.
So I guess actually, so going off of that, right? So let's say like if someone like, they demonstrate grit from their like personal statements, but they do come from a smaller like university, and they're also maybe their earlier research experiences were impacted by COVID, the pandemic. And so would other factors, like for example, letters of recommendation, be weighted for that particular applicant more so than someone else who didn't really come from, right, like a small college and things like that? So like yeah,
I think off the bat, we don't say, okay, if scenario A presents itself, this is how you weigh the individual components of the application. No, we don't have that. We just tend to make sure that we evaluate the whole entire package.
Got it.
Yeah, I think coming up with a code, if you will, right, is really a useless endeavor. It's really more about the individual.
Noted. Got it. Okay. And we also just, let's see. Okay, so Randolph, okay, so Denisha just answered it. Thank you, Denisha. But we just got a question. Regardless of your GPA, can a strong recommendation letter from your advisor really enhance your prospects for admission? So I guess this tackles like the low GPA, like if someone had a really low GPA, but their letter of recommendation or support actually, demonstrates really the applicant's grit and resilience. Can that make up for that?
So it's not just the letter of recommendation, it's also the personal statement, right? I mean, life happens. And so you might have had a sick parent, for example, and you just had to pay less attention to your classes. And that's the reality of things. And you put that in your application, you tell us your story, and we'll go back and look at the transcript and say, like, yeah, I mean, there's a big gap here, but it's understandable. And then look, afterwards, they killed it. They picked themselves up and then they went back at it. And that speaks volumes about the student's potential, right? So it's all about, you telling us your story, and it could be through letters of recommendation. It could be through your own personal statement. For your letters of recommendation, I mean, it's also good for you to speak to your potential letter writer. Can you write me a good letter? An emphasis on good letter, right? Not just a letter. And if they don't know you that well, you could fill in some of those gaps, like, this is what was going on while I was doing research, and I was able to spend a lot of time this semester, but maybe not this semester because of this and that or the other. But again, it's a story, and you tell us who you are, why you're interested in research, and we are basically just gauging your potential fit and potential to succeed in our program. So yes, absolutely. If there are gaps in GPA or otherwise, tell us about it. Be upfront about it, and we really value the narrative there.
I really appreciate that answer. I think so. That was also one of my insecurities as well, applying to grad school, because like the first year of college for me, I had almost like a failing GPA. And so that was a huge insecurity of mine, but it was like an upward trajectory. And even now, my PhD advisor always says, like, there's really no correlation between how well someone does in grad school and their GPA. And so it's all about really what are some of the factors that demonstrate resilience, which is exactly what you've hit, Paco. So thank you so much for that response. Okay, so I guess along with that front, right? So with with STEM career paths in general, they're non-linear. And so we actually get this question a lot. What advice would you actually give to someone, an applicant transitioning to a tangentially related field? Like, for example, someone who started off in BME, right? And then they are applying to material science or chemical engineering PhD programs. In other words, is your current research area like a large factor in, someone's PhD application?
If you don't mind, maybe I could start here. So, because I guess this kind of one is somewhat applicable to me. So first, just to kind of hammer home the last point, I didn't have a great GPA coming out of my undergrad degree. And I specifically actually mentioned that Michigan Mechanical Engineering, the mean was a B minus, and that means a 2.7, right? So if I was doing great and I had a B plus average, that meant I was well above the mean, but that just meant a 3.3. And anyhow, and I also played soccer, and that was something that, I just didn't have a really high GPA. So that was me, but I think I'm doing okay. Anyhow, so I very much, if I could say it any stronger, it's just, the GPA means so much in so many ways, but it's not the real predictor and litmus test for having a successful graduate school experience. Now, I also very much also kind of really love somebody who's wanting to get into a new field. I think that is almost the criteria for having a great PhD, is to get exposed into new fields, to try something new. And that's actually what graduate school is all about. Because if you're not learning new skills in graduate school and just doing the same thing you did as an undergrad, you're probably not advancing your skill set very well. And that's something that we try to do in our own lab, but I also recommend to new people who are coming in is to try to learn new components, learn new skills, learn things where you feel uncomfortable a lot. And I think that's really a hallmark of somebody who's not only brave, but also exhibits resilience and grit, is to try new things, to struggle, and to always ask for help. So I would say the first thing I would say is it's a lot easier to get started in a new field than it might seem, actually. Like, I know it sounds silly, but like, for example, for data analytics, there's so many constructive things you can do online, at home, on your own time. You can look at YouTube videos, you can look at all these websites that kind of tell you how to do, bioinformatics at home. And it's a really lovely opportunity to be able to take advantage of that, as well as, just trying something out. I think that's kind of really a great skill. And that's really also, I think, something that is unique to maybe being a minority, is to trying something new, to overcoming your own self barriers, to expose yourself in a new situation where you feel uncomfortable a lot. And that's something maybe minorities are more apt to do. I've always felt is that we can try to do things in a new field, in a new way, maybe more aptly because in part we're always, maybe a little bit more brave in that sense, in that we have to come out of our shell a little more frequently in order to, do the normal things that we do. So I'd say it's actually kind of a great thing to try that. Maybe get, see if you can do things on your own at home. You can actually order DNA at home, right? You can go to IDT and order, things you can put together in your fridge or in your microwave. It's very easy to do, or even on your stove. And so it's easy to kind of understand and rewrite some of these things that we think about. And I don't think it's a large factor in a student's PhD application. I think it's obviously helpful to have research experience and to be able to use some tools, but I think in a more critical attribute is somebody who's willing to learn and willing to try. And mentioning those things in an essay and creating that narrative, I think, is more important than having just one bullet point on a resume that says I did qPCR. So that's my take on that.
So I share a lot of the same sentiment as Carlos. So my trajectory is also a bit tortuous, right? So I did physics, nuclear engineering, and math for undergrad, medical physics for PhD. My postdoc was in chemistry, and now I'm faculty in BME, ECE, mechanical, and the med school. None of those overlap, right? They're all different. Every single one of them is different. And so, yeah, I mean, definitely having an interdisciplinary mindset is critical for research, as was mentioned. That being said, I mean, if you are hardcore BME and maybe you didn't go so hard into like organic chemistry or things like that, maybe chemical engineering might not be the best fit. So make sure that you are well positioned to succeed in that program. So PhD is largely about research, for sure, absolutely. But you also don't want to put yourself in a position where you're not going to be able to do well in the requirements of that program. So just make sure that you're comfortable with those. Now, for BME here at Georgia Tech, we used to have the requirement of having calculus-based physics, having all the way up to DiffQ, having organic chemistry as a requirement coming to BME. And a lot of the time, as we've progressed, we've kind of chipped a bit of those requirements because, for example, in my lab, where we do biophotonics, which is optical imaging, spectroscopy, it's very physics oriented. And I don't really need somebody who's taken organic chemistry. Like I just don't really need that. And so we also tailor that to the individual in terms of the requirements. We do want to make sure that you're successful in the program, in the lab, and also in the classes. And if you come into my lab, for example, no, you're probably not going to be taking a lot of those very chemistry heavy courses or very heavy bio courses. So you would do well even if you didn't have organic chemistry and so forth. So again, that's tailored. And so you do want to get a good sense for what program you're going into, because that's going to be dependent on the institution and the department itself. So I think that shouldn't deter you if that's what you want to do. Just make sure that you're well prepared to succeed in that particular program. And the research, yeah, I mean, for the research, if you're interested in that research, I think that is pretty much the number one requirement that I have for my prospective students. If you're interested in optics, even if you've never touched a laser or aligned any type of microscope, you will be fine. I will teach you those things, but you have to have the interest. So
yeah, so like Denisha's in neuroscience and I'm in like molecular biophysics, biochemistry, really. And so I think a lot of the same sentiment. Yeah, as long as you have like the interest, right, into doing research and like you're driven to like understand and answer this problem in like a related field, I think that's all that really requires. I think it's like, again, like strong interest and yeah, I think knowing like developing like sort of like an independent like mindset to, okay, like what are some of the things that I would need to learn to like answer this problem. So I really do think, yeah, a big part of it is also like interest and drive. So I will also say that my undergraduate thesis project was in a computational biology. Like I did network graph theory stuff, and now I've just touched pipettes and right, like purifying proteins from the cells and stuff. So super duper unrelated, but I'm really interested in this stuff. So I will say that it's not impossible. It's definitely possible. And like Carlos said, it's actually recommended that you have these certain interests. Yeah, thank you guys. Okay, so the next question. So what for you guys when you're reviewing applications, right? Like, so what stands out to you most when you're reading about someone's research experiences, whether that be in a personal or a research statement? And so actually I would, I know that in biological sciences, the PhD application, they don't tend to necessarily ask so much research statement, but more so I find it more common in like the engineering and physics PhD programs. And so specifically, what should an applicant place more emphasis on, right, in both the personal and the statement of purpose or SOP essays? Yeah.
So I generally have kind of a recipe that I guide the students that are in my lab or are applying. And this is just unique to me. I'm not sure how, kind of applicable it is for everybody, but for a personal statement, it always starts from where'd you come from, where are you now, and then where do you want to go? Very simple recipe, and describe the most salient experiences at each of those levels, how they shaped you, what you're really all about, and what you want to do given your personal kind of narrative, how those things kind of shaped you. Maybe they make you gritty, maybe they make you tougher, maybe they made you unique in a unique way that is completely different. We're all different, so like I think it's kind of fun to call that out. One of the things that I really like are people who actually adhere to that paradigm, is to really introduce themselves in a brave way and put themselves out there so that you can actually kind of feel something about that. We always talk about the organs of communication, the head makes you think a little bit, the heart kind of tugs at your strings a little bit, the belly kind of makes you laugh or something like that. You typically remember essays that have those components, right, a little bit more. And so research statements, you try to kind of paint the picture specifically about the things that you're interested in, the things that you are kind of hoping to do maybe in graduate school or learn about, and generally something that like is applicable to a research program that somebody's already working on. Because if you want to talk about a computational biology program, for example, and that department doesn't have anybody doing that, then that's probably not a good place for you to apply. So that things like that just really help when you're reading an essay. So it is also, remember, the unfortunate thing is we have to read a lot of essays. We have to read so many more essays and try to kind of create a story about a person. So if it's very long-winded and doesn't really kind of hammer home a point about it, it's hard for us to remember that too, right? But good salient points that I think are helpful, constructive, can help with a memory aid for us, really go a long way. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I agree with all that. That was very well put. Your personal statement is the one remaining piece that you have full control over that is not already set by the time you're applying, right? Like your GPA it's what it is. Your research experience, you're not gonna gain new meaningful research experience from the time you start applying your start putting together your application to the time that it gets reviewed or sent out anyway. So the personal statement is what you have full control over at that point, and it is there to tell us who you are, your background, why you're interested in pursuing research in that particular field, and importantly, why you think the institution that you're applying to would be a good place to do that. And I think at putting all those components, there's an art to it. And I completely agree with the organ, the head, the heart, and the belly. I think that was really perfectly stated. But keep in mind that this is your opportunity to tell us about you and why you're a good fit to this program, your interest in how you're gonna, what you're gonna do with this. And there's an art to putting all this together in a concise and salient way. So I think there isn't one thing that you should be paying more attention to. It's just, again, this is the whole part. And actually, which part you want to pay more attention to, it's entirely up to you, right? Maybe you've really had a really hard time in certain parts, and that hardship is really what made you then turn around and say, okay, now I want to focus on this. So then you really want to paint that picture. Or you could have had a completely different story, and that's what you need to emphasize. So again, there's no one size fits all here. But it is your one opportunity to tell us who you are, your perspective, and is the one part that you have full control over from the time that you start putting up your application together to the time that it goes out. So
Yeah, so I used to work for the Peer Review Center for Teaching and Learning at EL as a writing consultant. So I often also I used to do like peer review groups for the NSF GRFP. And so I tell, like, I feel like the personal statement at least mimics like the format of a lot of the PhD application, like personal statement, research statement formats. And so I tell them, it's like you said, it's almost like a dance between like, oh, hit on some of like the qualities of a PhD student that, you know, you already embody, right? Which is like resilience, independence, critical thinking skills, but also like, what do you want to do long-term career-wise? Like if you want to be a teacher, a professor, then like maybe incorporate some things about like you doing tutoring, or you were a TA for some of your undergraduate classes, things like that. So yeah, that's what I often tell like a lot of the people that I also used to you know, I guess help in regards to like their fellowship statements. And so
Yeah, I think that's a good point. To add on to that, we have access to your CV and your grades, right? So don't spend time telling us or listing the items that are in your CV, right? It's your time to tell us why certain things that are in your CV are important to you, how does that shape your interest in, and things like that. So yeah.
yeah. And also along with that front, I think also Carlos, you mentioned like balancing like soccer and grades, but also for people from like low socioeconomic backgrounds, right? Then you're probably juggling 3 work study jobs with research, with classes, right? And so I think that the statements are also the place where you can explain like, yeah, you can multitask, right? Like you also have grit, and that all that like really shines through in that regard. So yeah. Okay, so I also got ahead of myself a little bit earlier with the first question, but so when it comes to the letter of recommendation, how heavily is it weighted against other factors like the personal statement? And so this really comes into play because you know, with the leadership team for CL, we often think like some applicants may be like worried that they might receive mediocre or lukewarm recommendation letters. And so what can an applicant do in that case, right? If their advisor submits a lukewarm, mediocre LOR.
Yeah, I think that you can prevent that from happening by asking, can you write me a good recommendation letter? Right? And I think, you know, our job as faculty is to make sure that our students succeed. And one thing that I hope that no faculty would do is to say that they're going to write a great letter and not do that, right? And you should know, the applicant should know whether that faculty knows them well enough to write a letter that will be meaningful and that will stand out. So I think that picking out who your letter writers are is very important. They should be people who know your work, your ethic, hopefully either in a job or in research. I think I tend to ignore a lot of the letters that come from professors who are just basically, they were there in the class and said, okay, this student got an A+ in my class, and they were sitting in the front and they asked a lot of questions. And that's basically, if that's all they can say about you, that might sound like an okay letter, but it's really not. That didn't tell me anything about the student, right? So I think it's not so much. I think that the art here is picking up the right letter writers, that they know you in a certain aspect of you, right? And you know, we tell our students that it has to be somebody who knows about research or work. Like, you know, maybe your coach might know something about you, but we're really in grad school, we won't be very interested in that particular opinion, or maybe your pastor or somebody like that. I think having people who've done research, who can evaluate your potential to be a productive PhD student, those are the ones that I think are most telling.
I thought that was lovely. I totally agree. So frequently there is at least one letter who will come in and say, this person did well in my class, and that's about the extent of what that person writes in their letter. And to be fair, right, I teach a class of about 100 students, you know, in thermodynamics, very large undergraduate class, so I can't get to know every student. And some of the students who ask me to write them a letter, I've met maybe once or twice. And that's the extent of what I could say. They never wanted to come to my office hours to meet me, to talk or anything like that. And I tell them I don't really know what I would write in your letter because we've never really met. Sometimes they don't write back, right? And they consider that mean. But it's true. I would rather not give them an average letter because I don't know them and don't know their story than write something like that will not be helpful. I think that is an important thing to hammer home. Those things aren't really that helpful, even especially if they come from, like a well-known professor who you might think, oh, this person is writing on their behalf, but the extent of what they say is that they took my class and they got an A or an A minus. That's not really telling us anything more than they took a class that we could have seen on a transcript. So please don't do that.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I would advise students to not do, it's for example, if I see a letter that comes from a postdoc in a lab as opposed to the PI, I think that sometimes the person you're working with knows them better, but if it's like another PhD student or a postdoc, it just doesn't carry the same weight as the professor. And if the professor could say, for example, okay, I'll talk to the postdoc and this will be the perspective of the postdoc, but I was really impressed about the deliverables or the outcome. But the piece that has to come, it has to be from the PI of the lab. I feel like the level of perspective that a postdoc or somebody who's a graduate student would provide to the admissions committee is not quite the same as what we're looking for. So it is important that it does come from the PI. And so I have seen before where the undergraduate students, as they're applying for grad school, they interface more with a graduate student or a PhD student. So they ask that person to write the letter. I would strongly advise the students to go to the PI and ask the PI. And if the PI, if you've worked in their lab, they will be able to provide a meaningful perspective of your contributions, and at least talk to the team members and see how you've contributed to the research in that lab. So just an important piece of advice, I think, and I've seen that.
Thank you so much for also mentioning that, like that, typically the undergraduate, like they interact a lot with, right? Like the more senior lab members than necessarily the PI. And so we also get so many questions and emails from like GSMI scholars and students in general, being like, oh, what should I do? The PI doesn't really know me. And so, but I've worked a lot with postdoc. And so then we often, tell them like, hey, just email the PI, but also perhaps like CC, right? Like the postdoc, or talk to a postdoc or like the senior grad student first to see if, they could help assist with writing the letter, with the PI. And so, yeah. That helps. And so I actually have one question of my own. And so let's say if you guys have received like a set of like 3 recommendation letters, 2 are extremely strong and there's one that is lukewarm or mediocre. So like how does that come into play? So I know that Paco, you mentioned there's like or I guess with the ranking system with like applicants, right? And so with that lukewarm like LOR kind of detract away from like the strength of the application, or so like how would you guys like see that if there was like 2 really strong letters and there was like 1 lukewarm?
I mean, to be honest, you have 4 years of undergrad, right? And you're only going to do any meaningful work in maybe like 1 or 2 labs, right? And so if the 3rd letter is okay, maybe that one where it's like, okay, in a class of 35, or I also had a lab with a student and they were phenomenal, there were leaders in the lab, and that's mostly to the extent that they can say about you. That's fine if the other letters are like, oh, this person killed it in my lab, right? And because now we know you spent 3 years in one lab, so you have most of your experience from that one lab, but that letter better be very, very strong, right? But that's fine. Again, we know where you spent your time. We know what that PI that you spend most of your time with says about you. That's phenomenal. And the other ones, I mean, they won't know you as well. And that's understandable. Time is limited. So I know 1 mediocre letter will not sink the application if the other 2, 1 or 2 are extremely strong.
Just to hammer that home a little bit more, I think recommendation letters from tenure track kind of and tenured professors weight a little bit heavier than something like a lecturer who taught you in a class, right? And those types of letters are you don't weight them heavier, but you pay attention to them more, in part because that's where the person who probably knows them the best is going to write, the most positive letter. And so just when you're asking for recommendation letters, right? Sure, a lecturer who can kind of say that you did well in their class will write a nice letter for you is important. But a professor whose research group you were in did great work, worked well as part of the team, impacted, kind of good projects, things like that, will go much farther than somebody who did well in my class kind of a thing and who was nice. So just to make sure that that's very clear.
Awesome. Okay. So now this question is something we all of us, I would say, we're really interested in learning, and given that everything is so recent, right? And so we were all wondering what really would happen this upcoming cycle, given the Supreme Court ruling in June of this year. And so does the affirmative action ban impact like certain admissions requirements? So like, for example, diversity statement, which we are aware of in certain schools in the South in particular, and does the affirmative action ban impact also the review process, and if so, how? And aside from that, right, like let's say, aside from just like the admissions and review process, like what are some of the efforts that UMich, Georgia Tech, Emory are making to ensure that equity and inclusivity are met in your programs?
Yeah, so obviously this is the curveball for the year. But I do have to say, I don't think this will change anything about our process. The only concrete part that changes is the kind of checkboxes that you have about what race or ethnicity you might be from. That will not be present anymore. That won't be visible to the reviewers, to the faculty reviewing your applications. But that, I mean, we didn't really pay much attention. I mean, we don't set aside like this number of slots for certain races or ethnicities by any means. And we take the whole application package as a whole. And so the application process will not change. The personal statement can still say things like, as a Hispanic student, it was really challenging to do X, Y, Z. And again, it's your story. And we take the whole application package and review it as a whole. And so I think that it will not change much about how we review the applications. I think, sometimes the applicant may have only indicated that they're a minority group in those checkboxes, but maybe that means that, that wasn't that much of a factor in their upbringing and education and opportunities that they had. And so maybe we'll just miss that factor there, but hopefully the rest of the application will show that the student is strong, and that's fine. I think I don't think it's going to change a whole lot about how we review the applications. And maybe I'll stop here and hear what Carlos has to say and how that might affect them. But I think that we'll just have to be keep an eye out more in the personal statements and the letters of recommendation for any hints that the student might have had some struggles based on race or ethnicity and so forth that might contribute more to the grid than the rest of the application paints.
I really echo what Paco mentioned a second ago. It won't impact at least our application process and admissions requirements in any way, as far as I know. Something that we have done since I came here in 2017 is I've tried to mandate that we hold an extra 5 slots for underrepresented minorities or people of different backgrounds within that kind of gray area, that we try to hold 5 interview spots just for those people and make sure that we can always try to accommodate that. I'm calling it the Aguilar rule because I'm the one who made it up. And what's kind of unique about that is every year from that small little panel, we've had 1 to 2 offers of those people who were in that gray area who probably wouldn't have gotten invited. But I was like, no, these are great people, and we always ask, our admissions committee, can we just, squeeze 1 or 2 extra people in, and we can always do it. And it's so far worked really, really well. That process has now been extended into what is called the Emerge visit weekend now, and this is for minorities and underrepresented people to come visit Michigan for a weekend, and sponsored through our dime, and give us an interaction with these people who might be in a gray area or from a part of the country that has not been to isn't Boston or Cambridge, right? And I think that's one thing that has really kind of been helpful for us. And the reason why I say that is because clearly I am Latino, and our Latino population, since I've started graduate school, or not my graduate school, since I've become a faculty, has actually been increasing and increasing. And it's been really lovely to see that population grow, in part because when I was a graduate student, there was like 3 of us, I think, in our department of like 150 graduate students, and we all knew each other immediately. We would kind of make fun of one another, and just like nobody else looked like us, right? So anyhow, so I think we are trying actively to make this a more inclusive, more diverse department, and some of the effort is paying off. No, that's not to say that there isn't work to be done, because there clearly is, but there are, I think, good steps that we are taking towards making this much more kind of reflective of what the population looks like, rather than what we think an institution of higher learning typically looks like.
So let me add a little bit to that. I think that we definitely take it upon us to try to have as diverse of a community as possible, and we're very cognizant of that. I think that's all rolled into our kind of grit score, in understanding the hardships that the minority students have compared to the more traditionally majority background students as they go through undergrad and are thinking about applying to grad school. And so certainly we weigh that in. Part of a lot of sometimes the gray area part of the discussion certainly is how hard do they have to work to get there, and are they the things that they have shown, are those those show that they needed to work extremely hard to get to that level. So all that is weighted in there, and so maybe just different perspectives in terms of how we tackle that, but certainly we have a lot of emphasis in ensuring that we have a inclusive and diverse community. With Michigan and Berkeley, we just hosted the Nexus, for example, where we bring in minority students and try to coach them through how to apply for faculty positions and so forth. And we have events like that for students as well in BMES. We do outreach and so forth to try to make sure that the applicant pool is there and that we can draw from those strong applicants to come here.
Yeah, actually, along with that front, I'm actually not so quite sure about maybe funding, for example, for diversity preview weekends. And so are those also impacted on your respective institutions, or yeah, so if that even also exists, inviting students from minoritized backgrounds to come and visit, right, UMich, Georgia Tech, for a weekend and see, oh, this is what our campus is like, this is our faculty. So getting kind of the very first look on what a PhD life would be like. I'm not sure if the affirmative action ban would impact, outreach events such as that.
It hasn't for ours that we know of yet, because the program is next weekend. So
Got it. Yeah.
Keep happening for us.
One here too. Yeah. Okay.
So
yeah,
that's what I can say.
We'll continue to have diversity panels during an interview weekend. That's not going to change.
Awesome. Okay. All right. And then as for our next question, we've also touched on this quite a bit. But what are essentially some of the kisses of death on an application? So if an applicant seems pretty much almost perfect, what do they tend to be missing? So for example, someone who's extremely motivated, but with a very low GPA.
Well, maybe you can, oh, sorry, go. Have you ever found a perfect applicant? Because I've never found a perfect applicant. I mean, everybody's always missing something or other. So like nobody's perfect that I've ever seen in an application. They're great students everywhere. So I think trying to get a perfect application or a perfect, you know, kind of graduate school application is futile. Don't just be your best for yourself. But I just wanted to ask, have you ever, I mean, maybe the class up there,
some are very, very strong, sure, but I don't know what a perfect application is. Yeah, I mean, so in terms of kisses of death, I think the one place that tends to show what we call red flags tends to be in the letters of recommendation. If they're not good, then that's a red flag right off the bat. Another one is if we see an applicant that spent 2 years working in a particular lab and there's no letter of recommendation from that PI, huge red flag, right? And especially if you don't address it, like, oh, you know, we had this event, something happened, or blah, blah, blah. If you just ignore it and there's just that big hole, that is a significant red flag that will basically be, yeah, we'll just throw it in there and that application is probably doomed. Another one that we see is, oh, you know, I want to do XYZ at your university and we don't do XYZ at the university. That's another big red flag that this person clearly didn't do their homework there's no interest to coming to our program, and it won't be a good fit anyway. So that's another big red flag. Yeah, I think those are some of the more common ones that we see. And there's some that sometimes we see off comments in the personal statements, but those are very, very rare.
I think that's exactly what I would look for too, as a red flag. Maybe for a motivated applicant with a low GPA, I think, like we've already kind of said, I mean, this was me coming out of undergrad, is to really kind of put yourself in a position whereby you can kind of help the reader or the person who's reading the application understand why that may be, and give a little bit better of a picture for that narrative of you. So I think the better you can do that, to kind of not necessarily just explain, you know, why maybe some of your grades are a little bit lower, but just also hammer home that this is more than, you know, your narrative as a person, right? Maybe you worked jobs, played a sport, did a lot of outreach. These are all important things. Got sick, you know, had an accident. These are all things that are important and helpful to at least construct. So I typically don't look at GPA as much as I do kind of the statement. And I, you know, that's just maybe me, but I know some other faculty look more at GPA rather than the statement. So, you know, it's not the same for everybody. And so I really just would try to hammer home, try to put together that narrative. That's something kind of fun little part in the statement that makes you unique and makes that person reading that statement to remember you. And whatever you can do, whether that be, you know, kind of, you know, these organs of communication or something to kind of make yourself just be a little bit more remembered, will definitely go a long way.
Yeah, I also just thought of another question that I get so much, and I find that this is more of like, if you go into industry, that's like, oh, that's a no-no. And so what if someone says that they, you know, they want to go and pursue a career in industry in an application? I feel like that's probably a bit more common in engineering, but I know that in biological sciences, I find that a lot of my students or mentees, they always go like, Daisy, what if I don't want to become a professor? Do I have to lie and say that? And so then if they say something else, that would just like ding their application. So yeah, so then for engineering, at least, like, what would you say to applicants who don't want to pursue a career in academia? And is it okay for them to say that they want to pursue a career in industry?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's only certain percentage of students who want to pursue a degree or go in the academic route, and actually even fewer that actually make it all the way to professor. And so yeah, and a vast majority of PhDs will go out in some maybe government research or industry, and there's so many different things you can do with a PhD. We're not here to judge your potential career path. I mean, we're here to train you to be an independent thinker, to be a researcher in a certain area, and that's really what the PhD is about. We're as much as I would love all my grad students to become professors, I'm not judging them based on that, and that's perfectly fine.
I don't think it matters at all about industry. My students who have come into the lab have said, we've seen the way that you have to work and we want to go take a much cushier job and make more money. And I think that that's wonderful. My first two PhD students did just that. They took great industry jobs, got stock, and make more money than I do already. So, cannot blame them for that.
Yeah. Paco, were you gonna say something or?
No, I mean, yeah, my first PhD student went on to Apple, making lots of money. He's doing great. And then I have my next set of cohort. They're trying to do the academic route, and I'm like, yeah, but again, absolutely has no weighing on whether I accept the graduate student into my lab or whether a student gets accepted into this program. And it is absolutely fine.
Yeah, and to the students who also ask me that and they're really worried about that, I go and tell them like, oh, if you just literally look at some of like the Yale professors here, Ron Breaker and Anna Pyle, like in my department, like they have like a bunch of startups on the side, and so, right.
I will say one more thing though, actually, whatever you do, don't lie in your application. If you're not interested in doing research,
Yeah,
don't say that you're interested in doing research. If you're not interested in going to academia, don't say that you are just to get an edge. It won't come through naturally, and it will be a disservice to you and to the institution. So be as transparent as you possibly can.
100%. Okay, this is gonna be our last question. What advice would you give to students who don't get admissions offers this cycle?
So I may be unpopular in saying this, but first, they should definitely kind of not feel bad about that and recognize that they are not alone. There are too few spots and too many great applicants, and that this person should not feel like, you know, that they didn't deserve a spot and things like that. So it's really kind of nuts how competitive this thing has become over the last few years too. So I will give some numbers here. For example, we had in my lab alone last year, because we take students from biomedical engineering, from cellular molecular biology, bioinformatics. We had 682 students apply last year expressing interest to join our lab as the first or second choice. And we took one, or sorry, we took two. So the numbers are just not there for everybody. And it doesn't mean that I wouldn't have loved to take 100 people, but I don't have bandwidth or funding to do all that. And so it's just, it's nuts. And so it isn't, it doesn't mean anything not to get in on your first try. Okay. So that's the first thing is like it doesn't mean anything. It's just, maybe it wasn't a match or that person didn't have funding. That happens more often than not too. So that's the very first thing. The second thing is just that there are a lot of good schools that don't have enough candidates out there. Everybody wants to apply to the top 10 schools and try to go to a top 10 school all the time. But there are a lot of great schools that aren't top 10 schools that people should try to get into, because those are great schools and you can do great work from those that are outside the top 10. And so I would recommend trying to apply to a few schools that, maybe you might have a better opportunity to get into, compared to maybe the top 3 schools, things like that. And the odds are more than likely that, the smaller schools tend to give out those offers. And then the last thing is just, if you don't hit on the first time, maybe try it again, right? See what you can do over the next few months to maybe kind of address a certain part that might not necessarily be the strongest part of your application. Talk to a professor, talk to two professors, you know, and see if you can try to do something, maybe part-time in a lab, things like that. So it's not the end of the, you know, it's not the end of the story just because, you know, the story didn't take the next chapter in the way that you wanted it to go, and maybe it's just has to get a little bit richer before it moves on, right? So the character has to kind of develop a little bit more before it's ready to go on to the next step in the part of the theme of the story. And just to kind of normalize this, when I applied for faculty positions, the first time I applied, I didn't get anybody responding to me at all. I had to apply twice, and then it kind of got nuts, but I had to apply first. So it's completely normal. And in fact, it made me a lot stronger. It made me a lot more ready to take on that kind of you know, burden of becoming a faculty. So I hope that's helpful.
I echo exactly the same things that you mentioned, Carlos. Certainly, if a particular applicant doesn't get accepted the first time around, it certainly doesn't define you, or you know, even if it's your second or third, it doesn't define who you are. So it is highly competitive. And like Carlos, I also had to apply for faculty positions twice. I finally got an offer, multiple offers the second time around, but you know, the first time was really just a learning experience. And it certainly did make me a much stronger applicant the second time around, much more prepared to do the job that I do now. And also, if you don't get in, and it is what you want to do, you definitely want to pursue a PhD, then think about how to make yourself more, how to beef up your resume, how to beef up your experiences. You can take on a job in academia, that in industry that's more related to the research that you want to pursue, and then come back. Often those that go to industry for a little bit and then apply to grad school, it tells us a lot about your interest in going into grad school and doing the research, and those are very strong applicants. Also, the amount of the work ethic of those that go into industry first and then come back and to pursue a PhD tends to be different than those that are coming straight out of undergrad, and so we appreciate that, and we value that perspective as well. So there is, you can always come back into the academic route, and if you go to industry, so that there isn't a huge danger there. Or if you want to stay in academia, you can do as a research assistant, you can stay in a particular lab and really beef up your research experience. I had that recently where an undergrad student who was in ECE became really interested in doing biophotonics, but didn't really have any experience. He got into it his senior year. And so as he was looking into applying to grad school, he said, you know, I don't really have experience in this and I want to do this. And I said, well, why don't you stay in the lab for another year, get the experience that you need. We'll you know, you will get a good amount of time in the lab, and you'll get to know the field a lot better. And then he applied the next year, and now he's a PhD student in Yale. And so you know, it went from having zero experience in that field to now being, you know, in a really great program that was perfect to what he wanted to do. So just take a deep breath. It's not the end of the world. And if this is really what you want, there's multiple avenues to get there, but certainly don't give up. And also, it is important to emphasize that, you know, the Ivy League, the top programs are not the only ones around. I think that one thing that maybe you as an undergraduate student is not easy to understand is that you're not really going to the school to pursue your PhD program. You're going to a lab. You're going to learn the skills of that particular lab. And so it is far more important to get to know what an individual lab is doing. Is that really what you want to do? The type of work you want to do in a day-to-day basis? Is that the field that you're interested in? All those things are far more important factors than the name of the school. So it is really far more about the individual lab than it is about the institution. So doing a little bit more homework there, it would be very, very good. And so that, just to kind of put that out there, the emphasis should be far different.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for, your advice and tips. And I'm actually personally curious. And let's say if I didn't get into UBish for BME, and so would I have the opportunity to, let's say, reach out and be like, oh, what were some of the things that, my application like lacked, and so that I know for the next round I could maybe like, beef up on or improve on? Or is like the feedback on that, application like a no-go? Or I'm just personally curious.
It happens all the time. At least it does
Okay.
for me. It does for me. So at least in most cases, I try to respond. In several cases, I have not responded, in part because they have addressed me by the wrong name. Like for lack of a better way of saying it, dear Professor Robles, I really admire your, research in biophotonics, but they're saying this in an email to me. And so I won't respond to that. But other than that, like aside from that being, something like that, I'd be happy to do that. And I think most faculty probably do too, but that's just me.
Yeah, so I think the question was after the cycle. I think at that point, yes, it's absolutely really it's perfectly fine and reasonable for a student to reach out and say like, hey, what could I do to improve my application? Now that might get a little tricky because here, for example, we have 80 plus faculty, and not everybody's involved in the admissions process. Everybody, of course, is involved in recruiting students, but in our committee, so they'll probably just forward that email to me, and then I would have to respond. So maybe just doing a little bit of homework as to who you'd be sending out an email to. But certainly every single faculty in our program will know who to send that email to get some direct feedback, or maybe the faculty can do so directly. But I actually want to add to this question. I think the more important part is if you really want to go to grad school and you already kind of identified a few labs that you want to join, it is actually it puts you in a so much better position to reach out to those professors early on, so that when they see their application, the student's application come through, they already know that person, they've already connected the dots to the interest, what that person wants to do, and why that would be a great fit for the lab. And that's actually something that we do right before, while we're reviewing the applications. I basically email the faculty and ask them, if you've been in contact with any students and you're interested in taking them on, please let me know. Maybe, they don't really come through so much in the application, but if you had a really nice interview with them, that will weigh heavily on part of the package. It'll be another factor in the whole application. So reaching out early and talking to PIs who you might be interested in working with, I think that actually goes a long way.
Awesome. Yeah. So that actually also answers one of our questions submitted from a GSMI scholar. And she's also asked us like, oh, when would be a good time to actually, reach out to PIs I'm interested in working with, and what kind of information would you like to see in these like initial like contact emails, which she's actually going through at the very moment. So
I started getting them in September. And so it is perfectly normal, and that number kind of increases a little bit the closer you get to the admissions deadlines. So it is perfectly normal, encouraged. And in fact, I would go so far as to say every single person who has joined our lab has actually reached out before. And it just automatically creates a dialogue, something to remember that subsequent application by, and I think that's a really important thing. I also really want to echo something, Paco, that you said that was so really important, and that is you join a lab, right? You are joining a lab for graduate school. Now, maybe in Bob Langer's lab that has over 100 people with it, right? Maybe you'll get to meet with him once or twice, but in most labs, you're really going to spend 4 to 5 years with an advisor in a somewhat smaller group, right? Where you get to know that person a lot. And that tends to be the most critically determinant an important factor for PhD kind of happiness, for PhD, progression is how well the mentor and the mentee were in sync, got along, executed research goals, and helped each other grow. And I do say help each other because students help us grow too. It's an important thing to mention, an important thing to remember.
Yeah, when students reach out to me and they're like, "Hello, professor," and then the email's generic that they're just blasting maybe 50 different labs, I typically don't really pay much attention to those. So it has to be tailored, right? I have to know why you're interested in joining my group specifically for me to pay attention to those. So do your homework and be very straightforward about your interest and why you're interested in that particular lab. And I think that's the main determinant as to which ones do I pay attention to and which ones do I just like, okay, I got 500 emails today, I'm not going to get around to that one, sorry. And so yeah, I think that's a very important factor. At Dirty Tech, because you don't join a lab specifically, I think that's we get some students that are a little concerned about that, and so what we tell students is that yes, certainly you're joining a lab, but because we have a fairly large department, there may be 2 to 3 labs that you're interested in. It could be just one that you're really like hardcore. Yes, I want to go to that one, and that's fine. There still has to go through some type of a matching process, and but I think that we want the fit to be a good community where there might be maybe another lab that you're interested in joining. So that's I think a distinction for our applicants. It's different than in other institutions where you might do a whole year's rotation and then you choose from various different labs. But there are pluses and minuses about how much do you know a particular lab just from doing research and actually being there and so forth. So yes, you're absolutely joining a lab, but hopefully when you're applying to an institution, there's maybe 1 or 2 different labs that might be a good fit. So it's something to keep in mind there.
For sure. Okay. So we're actually towards the very end of the panel. And so I actually want to end off with asking both of you, what is some additional advice to our current prospective engineering PhD applicants? And so I actually want to stop sharing so all of our faces are in one screen. And so, yeah, any additional advice?
Sure, I can go first. I think just being genuine about yourself, your interest, do your homework, and get started early. This is not something that you want to put off until the week before it's due. Really spend some time in that personal narrative. Think about who you want your letter writers to be. Think about what you want to do, and think about the labs and the type of work that you want to do. A PhD is not a sprint; it's a marathon, and so you really have to be very passionate about the work that you do, and you have to be happy in the environment that you're in to thrive. So make sure that you think about it very hard, and that you have a good definition as to what you want to do. It doesn't have to be for the rest of your life, right? Like you don't have to have your whole life trajectory all planned out. But certainly having a good concrete idea, like this is definitely what I want to do and spend the next 5+ or so years doing this.
I don't really have much more advice to offer other than I hope you'll consider applying to U of M. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. I hope some of the things that I've said have been helpful and not deleterious towards considering applying towards a PhD. And thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this today.
Yeah. No, thank you guys so much for your time and for also providing so much like helpful advice, tips to helping the next generation of engineers in our CL community and beyond. And so this recorded panel will be given out to our GSMI scholars, mentors, but also uploaded onto our YouTube channel. So for anyone, who is applying to PhD applications, or of anyone, please share this recorded session in our YouTube link to those interested. And so, yeah, thank you again, Carlos and Paco, for your time. It means so much to us. And yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. It's great.
All right, take care.